We may have a sparse audience, but I know we have an enthusiastic audience. And as wildlife enthusiasts, I'm sure that you'll appreciate the stories that James is going to share with us. F.W. Champion is one of those legends of the conservation, the early days of conservation in India's forests. It's a name that evokes for me all of the excitement of the photographs that he took using Tripwire technology. Some of the first images we got to see of, I wasn't alive at that point, but in later years, some of the most exciting images of tigers, but other species as well. So James, his grandson is here, carrying forward that legacy, preserving his father's words as well as his grandfather's words as well as his grandfather's images. So I'm going to ask James to start us off. He's going to show us some of those images, and then Neha and I will be in conversation with him and talk about the book. So thank you, James.
Okay, namaste. Good afternoon. Thank you, Stephen, for that introduction, and thank you, Neha, for being up here on the stage with me. Just to give a little bit of background, I think you may be able to see an image of a camera. This is the camera that my grandfather used to use about 100 years ago to take some of the first images of wildlife ever taken in India. And if we move to the next slide, we can see one of the pictures of a tiger, which my grandfather took in 1924. So we are just over 100 years later, and it would be hard, really, even today, to get a sharper, clearer image. And I'll probably explain to you a little later in more detail about how he actually managed to get these kind of images. But they are quite iconic, and they appeared on the front covers of various magazines and so on around the world in the 1920s and 30s. So sometimes my grandfather would get a shot of a tiger, but at other times a different animal would come along, and of course he never knew what was going to come. And in this case it was a leopard. And here we see the first image ever taken of a sloth bear. And if you look very carefully, you can actually see the snouts of the two babies on the back of the sloth bear. So these are the kind of images that he was getting in the 1920s and 1930s. And this was his most famous image. We'll see in a few moments what sorts of magazines and so on it appeared on the front covers of. But even though this was his most famous image, my grandfather was a bit of a perfectionist, and he wasn't satisfied with this image. And his self-criticism was particularly around the fact that on the left-hand side of the image, you can see some bamboo around the side of the image, and he'd actually bent some bamboo from the other side of the path to create a perfect arch for the tiger to go through. But before the tiger came along, apparently that bamboo bounced back into its original position, and so he didn't get the arch. So he was very disappointed about that fact, because it wasn't such a well-framed image as he wanted to have. Can we have the next slide, please? Yeah, so he published a number of different works. Can you move to the next slide? Yeah, and the first one was called With a Camera in Tigerland, and it was published by Chatto and Windus, which was a big publishing house in the UK, first published in 1927. And I'm hoping to reissue it in 2027. So watch this space. And can you do the next one, please? Yeah, and then he published the second volume, The Jungle in Sunlight and Shadow, in 1934. And I don't know if I'll be reprinting this one in 2034, but we'll see. Can you go to the next slide, please? And he also published numerous articles in the Illustrated London News, the Indian State Railways magazine, etc. So, his work was very well known in those days, but these days it's kind of a little bit forgotten. And here we can see the cover of with a camera in Tigerland as it was back in 1927. And can you go to the next slide? Yeah, and here is another edition of The Jungle in Sunlight and Shadow, which was published, as I say, in 1934. And here we can see that same image that we've just seen on the front cover of the Illustrated London News, which was one of the biggest circulation magazines across the English-speaking world back in those days. And here we can see an article in the middle of that magazine. It's titled Big Game Photography for Beginners, and we can actually see that image of the camera that we showed just earlier in that article. And here we can actually see, this one was in 1925, and you can see a tiger actually pulling at its kill. And I believe that was one of the very first images of tigers that were ever taken in the wild. And here we can see that famous image that I told you about on the front cover of the Illustrated London News. So he was well known in those days. Here's an article that he wrote in India magazine, which I don't know very much about. It was called The Senses of the Tiger. He wrote a lot about the habits of the animals that he photographed. But the key thing to remember also about F.W. Champion is that he was a conservationist before his time. And in fact, he influenced Jim Corbett, who I'm sure many of you have heard of, to move a little away from hunting the animals to shooting them with the camera. And Corbett acknowledges that in his book, The Man-Eaters of Kumaun. And here's another sort of full-page spread of some of F.W. Champion's photographs in one of those Illustrated London News editions. And here we can see one of his other famous photographs in the front page of the Illustrated London News. Next one, please. There's that same image. And this one is a quite magnificent image. And this was a young tiger that spotted its own reflection in the camera and crouched down, fired off the tripwire, and apparently, immediately after this photograph was taken, the tiger jumped and attacked the camera and knocked it over, but luckily, it didn't break the camera, and this was the image that came out. And there's that same image, not in the magazine. He got some awards for his wildlife photography. This is the International Exhibition of Nature Photography in 1936. And I published the first collection of writings and photographs of F.W. Champion back in 2012. I launched it at the Kumaun Literary Festival in Nainital. And this is now the second volume, which I'm launching here at Jaipur. And I got some very nice reviews for Tripwire. So let's hope I get some similar reviews for the Tiger's Champion. And of course, I chose this name, the Tiger's Champion, because he was a champion of tigers in that he was campaigning for their protection at the time when his colleagues in the forest department and in the army were busy shooting tigers. And my grandfather didn't like that, so he tried to influence people to pay more attention to trying to photograph them and study them rather than to kill them.
Thank you. Thank you for that, James. And I'm lucky to grow up in a time where everybody has a camera. And my own work in wildlife conservation is informed by the camera trap images we get, the wealth of data we get from camera trap images. It's incredible that these images that you showed us are almost 100 years old. And I want to know a little bit more about the process that he used to take these pictures, and also tell us how the method that your grandfather used, the tripwire and the powder and all of that, has informed the science behind camera traps today, 100 years hence?
Yes, that's a very good question. Thanks very much for that. So what my grandfather would do is he would go out into the jungle during the daytime, and his job as a forest officer gave him that opportunity to be in the jungle all the time. So he would go out and he would find a track that a tiger was regularly using, and he could see that by looking at the pug marks in the sandy soil. And then he would go late in the afternoon with that camera that we've just seen an image of, and he would place it next to that path, and he would camouflage it with branches and leaves, and then he would focus the camera on where he thought the tiger's face would be if it was coming in the correct direction, and he would then run the wire across the path and connect it to a flash. And in order to make the flash work, he had to spoon magnesium powder into the flash. There was also a battery nearby, and he would then disappear and go away. In the early days, he sat up in a machan in a tree nearby, but he got malaria, and his wife, my grandmother, forbade him to do that anymore. So he would then go back to the forest rest house where he and my grandmother were staying, and then they would pray throughout the night that the tiger or whatever other animal was coming in the right direction. And then the next morning they would go and pick up the camera and bring it back to the forest rest house. And he had a portable dark room, which was actually a tent lined with black velvet. And he would go in there and he would develop the photo. Of course, only one photograph could be taken per night because it was a glass plate negative. But that system has now evolved into the modern camera trapping. But of course, these days, the tiger or whatever animal it is doesn't touch a wire. It goes through a sensor, and that automatically fires off the camera. And of course, you can also take moving images with camera traps these days, and you can take unlimited numbers of pictures during a night. But of course, my grandfather could only take one image per night, and there were many failures, but the ones that were successful were extremely successful, as you can see, and that's how he made his name as a wildlife photographer. And it's quite touching, really, that these days researchers use that modernized version, camera trapping, of which he was the pioneer.
We've learned a lot through camera trap images, and even the ones of your grandfather show us the hidden lives, in a way, of the wild animals. It's
yes, that's absolutely true. And one of the things that he noticed was that each tiger could be individually identified by its pattern of stripes. No one had really recognized that before. So he began to get to know these tigers that he was photographing regularly, and he could see, how long they lived. Of course, there were plenty of shooters around in those days, but he could monitor the populations of tigers in his area. Yeah.
No, and you had said one other thing when we were talking before, James, about the way in which he didn't know whether the tiger would be coming towards the camera or be going in the other direction. So he got an awful lot of photographs that I'm sure weren't published of the hindquarters of the tiger as it walked away.
Yes, that's absolutely true. And sometimes, of course, the camera would be tripped off by accident, maybe a falling branch or something like this. But the thing is that each glass plate negative cost quite a lot of money, and he wasn't a particularly wealthy man. So it was actually quite an expensive business to do this kind of photography. The magnesium powder cost a lot, and so on. But yes, he did get a lot of rare images of different types of animal.
And those were not published.
Most of them were not published.
Not published.
No.
One of the wonderful things that I was reading the Tiger's Champion, and it's all about natural history, but it's also about family history. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the way in which the natural history and family history coincide, both in F.W. Champion's experience, but also in your experience following in his footsteps.
Yes, that's also a nice question. Thank you very much. I grew up in the UK, but we've had the same family home for several generations. And my grandfather and my grandmother retired there. And so there were a lot of my grandfather's images on the walls in that house. And so I kind of grew up with those images as a part of my family. But my grandfather, who I did know, he died in 1970, and I was 7 years old at that time. There was one famous occasion when he trod on my model railway and I was not very happy about that. But yeah, I did know about him, and of course I admired him very much. And that kind of inspired me to become interested in wildlife myself. And I've done several journeys in his footsteps, the most interesting one of which was in 2006, when I retraced his and my grandmother's and my father's footsteps to the Pindari Glacier in Kumaon, following precisely the journey that they'd made exactly 70 years to the day after they did it, staying in the same PWD bungalows and forest rest houses and photographing precisely the same images from precisely the same spots exactly 70 years later to the day. And that was really a wonderful experience for me. And I felt like I really bonded with my grandfather then, because I was able to read and see the exact places that they'd been. Now, my father was 8 years old at that time, and he had a governess who was a lady who came out from the UK to teach him. She joined my grandparents and my father for 2 years, teaching him, and she kept a diary, and that journey to the Pindari Glacier was recorded in that diary, and her photographs, which were taken with a Kodak box Brownie camera, were cross-referenced with the diary. So that's how I could see precisely where they were on every single day of that journey. And to redo that journey 70 years later was really a very emotional thing. But the family thing was a bit difficult for my father, because he was born in India, in Lansdowne, and he had only been to the UK once when he was 4 years old, before he was sent home, and I say home, to Scotland. But he didn't know Scotland, and in 1936, my grandmother took him back by ship to the UK, left him in a boarding school on the coast near Edinburgh, and came back to India. And then, because of the Second World War, apart from a brief home leave that my grandparents had in 1938, my father didn't see his parents again until he was 18 years old, when they came home in 1946. And when he went to meet the ship that my grandparents were coming home on, he didn't know what his parents looked like. And he didn't know how to speak to them, because the last time he'd really spoken to them was when he was 8. Anyway, he found his parents, but they also didn't know how to speak to him. And of course, he'd changed a lot more in the 8 years that he hadn't seen them than his parents had. And my grandfather still thought that he was an 8-year-old boy, even though he was a very independent 18-year-old young man. And I think that caused some difficulty, really. But it's deeply inspired me. My grandfather's work has deeply inspired me. And one of my roles, I think, in life is to keep his work alive and to kind of inspire younger people to think carefully about the environment and to act responsibly and to protect wildlife, which was the message that he left.
So your grandfather was working in the Forest Service at a time where tigers were known as game. Tigers were known as sport. Tigers were hunted by people, but he was very different. He didn't approve of tigers being hunted at all. So tell us a bit about that. And it's interesting now, in post-independence India, you can't even say that you want to hunt a tiger. Thank God for that. So we've inherited a conservation legacy in modern India where you cannot speak of hunting a tiger. But he used to speak about it before it was illegal to do so. So that's very interesting.
I know, it is very interesting. And actually, my grandfather was quite brave, really, because he put across the conservation message and the anti-shooting message in his writings, but he had to be very careful and diplomatic about how he did that, because his colleagues in the forest department were quite keen shooters and hunters. And so if my grandfather criticized them too much, then there was a danger that they would kind of disrespect him or ostracize him, or his career would be damaged. So that was quite difficult. Sometimes my grandfather used to issue permits to visiting hunters for areas where he knew there were no tigers. And there was one occasion...
Brilliant.
Yes, there was one occasion when an old shikari, an old hunter, Papa Doc John Wakefield, who Stephen met as well, he used to organize hunts in the areas where my grandfather used to issue the permits, and he definitely issued him with some permits for areas where he knew there were no tigers. Well, I met John Wakefield when he was, I think, 92 years old at Billy Arjun Singh's house near the Dudhwa National Park, and we had a lovely tea party. But John Wakefield, he said to me, "Now, young champion, I have a bone to pick with you." And I was rather nervous. He looked quite fierce, and he said, "I know your grandfather used to issue permits to me for areas where he knew there were no tigers." And then there was a long silence, and he didn't look particularly friendly. But then he said, "But I won't hold it against you." And I found that very, very touching. Yeah.
We're running out of time, but there's one part of your book, one story in the book that appealed to me a great deal. Obviously, tigers and what might have been referred to as big game were a big part of his photography, but he also collected butterflies towards the end of his life. And I think if you could talk a little bit about the way in which you then carried that forward by mounting those specimens. Tell us, first of all, where you found them and in what condition they were and how old they were.
Yes, well, that is quite interesting. My grandfather didn't collect butterflies during most of his career, but he did come from an entomological family because his father, George Charles Champion, was a professional entomologist who'd collected butterflies and beetles in Central America in the 1870s and 1880s. And most of those collections are still in the Natural History Museum in London today. But when in 1947, my grandfather lost his job, obviously, when independence came, but he remained in India with my grandmother for another few months. And he didn't really know what to do during that time. And so he decided to start making a collection of butterflies, which is not very politically correct these days, but there were plenty of butterflies in those days. So he collected those butterflies. He then moved to East Africa, and he was in Tanganyika, which is now Tanzania, from 1948 to 1952, and he collected butterflies there as well. Now, when they moved back to Scotland, the butterflies were left in an old trunk. They were folded in triangles of paper, which were actually old checks, which was quite interesting, so we could see what my grandfather was spending his money on. And each butterfly was in a triangular envelope labeled with where it was caught and on what date. And then they were just left under the stairs in my grandparents' house. My grandfather died in 1970, and my grandmother lived on in that house until 1983. And then there was one time, probably when I was about 7, when we opened a cupboard, which hadn't been opened for a very long time, and we found this trunk, and it was locked, but we managed to break the lock open, and there were these old biscuit tins full of butterflies, and they were my grandfather's butterfly collection. Now, I learned how to mount the butterflies, or we call it setting. So you have to pin the butterflies first, and I spent much of my childhood doing that, and I still have his butterfly collections, which are in remarkable condition today. And as a result of that experience, I can now recognize a very large number of the Indian butterfly species if I see them flying around, because I learned all about them as a child from my grandfather's butterfly collections. And actually, I also went to the FRI, the Forest Research Institute in Dehradun, and I did some volunteer restoration work on their butterfly collections, which I think are one of the most important ones in India today. So it's left a nice legacy. Great. Yeah.
Thank you very, very much, James. I apologize that we didn't have time for questions, but I'm sure James will be in the festival, and I think he'd be very happy to answer questions if you have, and need to stop him and quiz him on that. But thank you again for a wonderful session, and congratulations on the book.
Thank you very much. And thank you very much to
Thank you.
both of my colleagues here on the stage.